Welcome to Jewish History Soundbites podcast with Yehuda Geberer. Immerse yourself in the rich tapestry of Jewish history as we explore fascinating tales and uncover hidden gems from our glorious past. Brought to you by our proud sponsor, Cross River, a leader at the intersection of financial services and technology, committed to empowering the communities they serve. Cross River's steadfast support fuels our mission to preserve our heritage and foster a vibrant future for all. Contact Cross River through their website at crossriver.com.
A date which will live in infamy.
Both of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Von 1000 Shabbos at this guitar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Churban.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too late. With Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode I called it Naming Catastrophe. In other words, what is the term that we use for the Nazi murder of European Jewry, primarily between the years 1939 and 1945, although it's from the beginning of the Nazi regime, even from 1933. And before I get into this topic, which I find fascinating, I just want to do some feedback from last episode. Last episode we did on Sephardic purity, and I discussed the abbreviation Samach Tet, and I talked about how I thought it was Sfaradi Tahor, but then I read an article by Professor Mark Shapiro that it really is Seifei Tav or Seifei Tav, so it means something else. I got a lot of feedback on that, so I want to read some of the feedback, and I'm going to give some commentary. So this feedback is actually going to be a nice chunk of the episode, another few minutes. So if you are not interested in this topic or this feedback, then you can just skip ahead to when I get to the topic at hand. But I want to quote from a letter I received. It's from a friend of mine who's a very dedicated listener and extremely knowledgeable, really knowledgeable. And he happens to have good Sephardi yichus. So he said like this: regarding the podcast on Sephardim, my great-grandfather was the Av Beit Din of Monastir, Chacham Bashi Bechor Chaim Elias Kasurla, and he was the Av Beit Din, like we said, of Monastir, as the city was known in its Turkish heyday. Kasurla is from the Spanish Cazorla, our origin city in Spain, and he would sign his name Samachtet, and in my family it was passed down to mean Sfaradi Tahor, that we never converted. My family Masorah is that we left Spain in 1391 after the pogroms, and we never converted. I don't like self-appointed scholars who come in with the sense of knowing better than thousands of families' lived experience. I appreciate why you didn't speak intensely, though you could have, against Professor Shapiro, but it's akin to the white Europeans that colonized minority places. This dude walks in and thinks he can educate us. So that's the end of his letter, and I want to clarify a few things from his letter and my position on it. It's mostly that I agree with him. First of all, what's he talking about? The place then it was called Monastir in the Ottoman Empire. Today it's known as Bitola in northern Macedonia, in the Balkans, what was formerly Yugoslavia. A very rich Jewish history, by the way. I have to get to the story of this community someday. Now, the point that he's making is what we refer to in historian circles as social history, that I've mentioned on this podcast before. Social history, in essence, creates a reality. If you are not a social historian, you go only by the text, in some sort of ivory tower intellectual, while ignoring the social history, how regular people behaved and lived, and not necessarily by text and chronicles and written sources, then you miss most of history. And specifically, that's in general social history. But specifically in this context, we should say that terms evolve. All kinds of terms evolve, especially ancient terms that are used by wide, large communities over centuries and centuries. The origins of the abbreviation Samach Tet are likely, as Professor Shapiro described, with substantive proof that the term Samach Tet was used by Ashkenazi Jews as well as Sephardic Jews. It was even used by Sephardic Jews pre-expulsion. Now, all those proofs and many more prove that the origins cannot mean Sfaradi Tahor. So it must mean something else, such as Sofo Tav or Sefei Tav, something like that. But terms evolve, and they're used for many, many centuries, and Samach Tet can take on new meanings over the centuries. So if there were families who signed their names over the course of 200 or 300 years with Samach Tet, and they meant it when they took the pen and to the paper and wrote the letters Samach Tet, they had in mind that we mean Sfaradi Tahor. So Professor Shapiro and many historians like him, who go by the text, who ignore social history, they would go to 10 generations of that family over 300 years and explain to each and every one of them that they're wrong. And he has proof that they're wrong because the origins of the term are Sofo Tav and not Samach Tet. But social historians will note that the origins are exactly as Shapiro says, but then recognize that the term came to mean over time in a broader social and communal context. It came to mean something else. It came to mean Sfaradi Tahor. And there's lots to say and elaborate on this topic in general. I just want to read one more feedback that also illustrates this point, as I've been saying. So I'm reading another letter from another listener. I'm listening to this week's episode. My feedback is like if Mark Shapiro would discover one day that NKVD does not really mean Russian secret police, but it rather means fruit punch without vodka, then perhaps he's right. But it's completely irrelevant, of course, because to everyone using the term, it means secret police. The same thing here. Samach Tet means Sfaradi Tahor, origin notwithstanding that it means something else. It reminds me of something an old Litvak once told me, that the great Hasidic Rebbes would write Hey Kuf after their name for Hakatan. This old Litvak said that the Rebbes knew that everyone would read it as HaKadosh, and that's why they used it. So that's a very humorous letter, but he's making the same point. By the way, NKVD actually means the Soviet secret police. It does not mean fruit punch without vodka. He was just giving a mushel. But that's that topic, and I think we can leave it to be and move on to today's topic. And it's very timely. It was just Asara B'Teves, the fast day, which in Israel is known as Yom HaKadish HaKlali, a day where we recite Kaddish in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. The Rabbanut of Israel made this as a day, a special day, because Holocaust survivors in the early years of the state did not have a yahrzeit. So they asked rabbis, what should we do? When should we observe the yahrzeit? And finally the Rabbanut came up with this idea that everyone can observe the unknown yahrzeits on Asar B'Teves. Everyone can say Kaddish for their relatives that they don't know when the yahrzeit is. So it's Yom HaKadish HaKlali. And in another few days, it is going to be January 20th, which is the 83rd anniversary of the Wannsee Conference, which is related to today's topic somewhat. Actually, not really, but the Wannsee Conference, when a bunch of Nazi bureaucrats discussed how to implement the final solution, which had been decided upon a few months earlier. And January 27th is coming up in another couple of weeks. And January 27th, 2025 is a very special anniversary. It's International Holocaust Day. But January 7th, January 27th was chosen because it was the day of the liberation of Auschwitz in 1945 by the Red Army, the Soviet Red Army. So January 27th, 2025 is the 80th anniversary coming up of the liberation of Auschwitz. and it's probably the last time that, last big round number anyway, that many Holocaust survivors will be able to participate live in Auschwitz by this very solemn ceremony. So it's a good time to speak about this topic of where did the term Holocaust come from, or Shoah, or Churban. What do we refer to? What term do we use to refer to this destruction of European Jewry? So, if you noticed, on Jewish History Soundbites, we only talk about the Holocaust in a peripheral way. Holocaust rescue, or all kinds of things like that. I wouldn't say never, very, very seldom do I do heavy Holocaust topics about the actual murders and the camps and stuff like that, which I do on my tours, of course. But we don't do heavy stuff, especially long stuff like that. Generally, we don't do it in the context of Jewish History Soundbites. I do get the impression that many listeners are interested in these topics. So I happen to be able to share with you that for the last several years, about 5-6 years or so, I've had the privilege of doing the Holocaust education program at the Shapel's Darchei Noam Yeshiva in Yerushalayim. So I deliver the lectures at the Holocaust educational program of Shapel's Darchei Noam, and it's 3 lectures a year, and it's in-depth lectures. It's like over an hour and 10 minutes or so, hour and 5 minutes, hour and 10 minutes, hour and a quarter even, and it's 3 every year. So it's 5 years. It's probably about 15 lectures. I've never repeated a topic, so it's 15 heavy, in-depth Holocaust topics that I've delivered there, and I've just found out recently that Shapel's Yeshiva, Darchei Noam Yeshiva, makes their lectures, all their Torah lectures from all rabbis who speak there, and including me, even though I'm not a rabbi, all available online for free at the Shapel's website, and it's on Spotify and on Apple Podcast and on YouTube. And I will post, and I received permission from them to publicize this, that if you want to listen to my lectures there, you can go access it there. So those are heavy Holocaust lectures, long Holocaust lectures, on various different topics across the Holocaust, story. So if I remember, I'll post all the links in the show notes. If not, you can pretty easily find it. Just Shapel's Darchei Noam virtual Bais Medrash, I think it's called, on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, whatever. So anyways, let's go finally to today's topic, the names of the Holocaust. So we'll say like this, names of the Nazi extermination of European Jewry, primarily between the years 1939 to 1945. How do we refer to that era? How do we refer to that story? How do we refer to that tragic, catastrophic murder of European Jewry? What are the names that we can use? So, in Hebrew, it's very often referred to as Shoah. In English, it's very often referred to as Holocaust. In many circles, in certain academic circles, it's referred to as destruction. In many religious circles, they use the Hebrew word for destruction, Churban, or even Churban Europe, or Churban Europa. In other circles, they use the Nazi term. The Nazis had a term for it also, Endlösung, final solution. I'm probably mispronouncing that in German. But it's final solution in English. That's another way to refer to it. Sometimes we use the very general term genocide, extermination of the attempted extermination of all Jewry, the pretty much almost total annihilation of European Jewry is a genocide, or if you want to be more specific, a Judeocide. Or you could call it extermination, or annihilation, or a catastrophe. Actually, in the Soviet Union, in Russian, they would refer to it in those years as a catastrophe, the catastrophe that took place, the Nazis, during the Nazi occupation. Of course, in the Soviet Union, they weren't referring specifically to the Jews, but all Soviet victims of Nazi Germany was the catastrophe. So these are all kinds of terms. In other words, there's all kinds of reasons to use or not use all these terms. There's a lot of debate about which is the proper term to use. So I want to delve into a few of them, the historic origins and how they developed. For instance, the most commonly used term, especially in English, is Holocaust. So the etymology is some sort of Greek word that it comes from, which means a burnt offering to the gods. But it evolved, of course, over the centuries. We just spoke about a few minutes ago about how terms evolve, so Holocaust evolved as well. It evolves over the centuries to describe catastrophe. It describes specifically human-induced catastrophe, such as great massacres. In fact, there was the Armenian genocide at the end of World War I, and in the aftermath of World War I, up to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire perpetrated a genocide against the Armenian nation. And in the interwar period, in the 1920s and 30s, scholars and historians and Armenians themselves, it was very often used the word Holocaust to describe the Armenian genocide during those years. Now, over time, already in the 1940s, it slowly started to evolve the use of the word Holocaust to describe Nazi atrocities. And later, I think during the liberation of the camps, so there are some newspaper reports that say it looked like a virtual Holocaust, what they saw in the camps. So it was already used at the end of the war. And later on, it was specifically used to describe the genocide of the Nazis against the Jews. By the it took a long time though. By the mid-1950s, and specifically the 1960s, it was finally used as accepted worldwide to describe what we now almost exclusively refer to as the Holocaust. So the term evolves over time. That's the origin of Holocaust. How about Shoah? So fascinating. First of all, it's a word from Tanakh. It appears quite a few times in Tanakh, and there's, depending on the context, it has all kinds of variants of what it means. Some sort of, again, catastrophe or something like that, or a smoke cloud catastrophe. So, different variants where it comes up. Tehillim, it comes up quite a few times in Tanakh, and in 1933. Shortly after Hitler comes to power and passes the first legislation against German Jewry, again, this is before any mass murder or anything else, Hebrew newspapers in the Yishuv are already using the term Shoah to describe what's happening to German Jewry, even before mass murder, even before the war, 1930s. In fact, Chaim Weizmann delivered a speech at the Zionist Congress in 1933, shortly after Hitler's rise to power. And Chaim Weizmann delivered the speech in German, as were most of the speeches at the Zionist Congresses. And when they translated he used the German word for catastrophe, which I don't know what it is, but whatever the German word for catastrophe is, he said in his speech, there's a catastrophe happening to German Jewry. This is in 1933. When the Davar newspaper and other newspapers in the Yishuv, in Palestine, in Eretz Yisrael, translated Weizmann's speech, they used the word Shoah, just as a translation of the German word. In other words, they didn't even invent the word. It was a good Hebrew translation of the word. And they keep on using it. So it's used throughout the 30s, it's used throughout the 40s, and very quickly, much quicker than Holocaust. Holocaust takes at least till the mid-50s, probably even till the 1960s, till it becomes a accepted term to use to describe the Nazi extermination of European Jewry. Shoah happens in Hebrew-speaking areas in Israel much quicker. By the 1940s, it's pretty much exclusively referred to as Shoah. Another term that's used, another historical origin of the term that's used, we said is final solution. Where does the term final solution come from? So I said it's a Nazi term. The Nazis used it in their own description of what they're doing to the Jews. He called it Endlösung. You want to say the complete term is Endlösung der Judenfrage. Final solution. Endlo is final. Sung is solution. Der Judenfrage, to the Jewish question. That's how it was referred to in Nazi documents. Now, so that's a term that could be used. And many scholars used it in the early years because it made the most sense, because we're using what the Nazis themselves described what they're doing to the Jews as a final solution. Now, that's in the Nuremberg trials. They used the prosecution. they referred to it, they did not refer to it as Holocaust or Shoah, they referred to it as the final solution. They used the Nazi term, which makes sense. Early years of Holocaust historiography, many historians used it. There are limitations of using it, and that influences how we use it today. Today, it's much less common to use it, and I'll explain why. There's two big limitations of using the term final solution. First of all, as a historical description, it's pretty lousy, because the final solution only refers to the mass murder extermination. The gas chambers, the mass shootings in the pits in the East, and gas chambers, right? The mechanisms of mass murder, but which it also only describes a limited chronological scope of the events, because we're talking about from towards the end of 1941 until almost the end of the war, right? So what about anything until 1940, till the end of 1941? That's not covered in the final solution. So it's very limited. It's a very limited term. If I say the Holocaust or Shoah or Churban or destruction, then it covers the entire gamut of anything the Nazis did to Jews under any circumstances, not just the gas chambers or the mass shootings, the actual mass murder. That's one limitation of the term final solution. Another limitation is not only in scope, it's in a moral limitation, is that we're borrowing a Nazi term. We're almost like, it's almost like we're accepting the Nazi term. That the Nazis said there's a Judenfrage, there's a Jewish question. That Jewish question has to be solved, and therefore we need a solution to this question. And this is the final solution. So we don't want to accept Nazi terminology, and definitely not imply any acceptance of Nazi ideology, that there needs any solution. We don't believe that there's any problem that needs a solution. So why should we use this term altogether? So that's another limitation of it. But in the early years, for lack of a better term, it was used not only in Nuremberg, early historians used it. For instance, William Shearer, famous author, CBS reporter and author and historian, and he wrote one of his most famous books is The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. He never used the word Holocaust once in the book. He referred to the final solution. Another term to use is genocide. The genocide of European Jewry by the Nazis. Now, genocide is a very general term, and the term is side, of course, means murder, right? Homicide is a murder of a person, and all the sides. So geno is an entire nation, entire people. So that would be a murder of a people, and here it's specifically of the Jewish people. So that could be a very legitimate term. The problem with it is that it doesn't make it unique. I mean, this was the greatest genocide, and maybe who said it is unique, right? That's another question. The uniqueness of the Holocaust. Maybe we'll get to that one day. That's another full podcast. There's a lot of big debate about it, and people get extremely passionate and emotional about the subject. It is unique. It's not unique. What makes it unique? In any event, I'm not going to get into it now. Maybe we'll do it for another time. It's an exciting topic, but genocide definitely makes it that it's another genocide of the many genocides in human history. Maybe this was the greatest genocide. Maybe there was some uniqueness to this genocide, but genocide is a legitimate term. Now, in the early years after World War II, German historians used the term genocide. Well, they used the German word Völkermord. Mord is murder. Volk is people. So Völkermord is a murder of a people, meaning genocide. Or they would write it out specifically to make it unique. Der Völkermord an den Juden, the genocide of the Jewish people. So that would be a more specific term. The genocide of the Jewish people perpetrated by the Nazis during the rule of the Nazi era. That would be a term that was used, and it was used in German historian circles, but also not only in German. It was used, it is, and it still is used till today. The word genocide is also a term that's used. And here we come to another term. Another term, destruction in English, or churban in Hebrew. Is it a religious term? So many say, churban has connotations of, Churban Bais Hamikdash, the destruction of the Bais Hamikdash. it points to Jewish history. It points to traditionalism, a traditionalist term that it's part of Jewish history, and it's one chapter, perhaps the most tragic chapter, but it's one chapter in the long scope of Jewish history and everything the Jews have experienced in their many, many churbans, or churbanais, in their many destructions. And we'll get to that. I want to delve into that a little bit more in depth, explore that a little bit, but I just want to point out that it's not exclusively a religious term. It's also a secular term. For instance, in Polish, the Holocaust is sometimes referred to as the Holocaust, but very often in Polish historians and it's in the media, it was referred to over the years as Zaglada Żydów. Zaglada is destruction. Zagwada Żydów, the destruction of the Jews. So it's not, definitely the Poles weren't referring to the destruction of the Jews because they wanted to use a religious term, translation from Churban, so they just felt that was the most appropriate term. By the way, the preeminent Holocaust historian, the dean of Holocaust historians, or the pioneer of Holocaust historians, Roel Hilberg, he titled his book, The Destruction of the European Jews, and he specifically did not use the word Holocaust or genocide or Shoah or final solution. He specifically chose the term destruction because he felt that was the most appropriate term. So destruction or churban can be either a religious or secular term. So we went through several terms. I mentioned there's a few others, but for sure Shoah and Holocaust emerge as the most popular and most definitive terms, and it was a rather long process. Like I said before, Shoah in Israel caught on pretty early. It's interesting that in recent years, probably from the 1980s and on, Shoah started to catch on even in non-Hebrew speaking world, because for most of its history, it was pretty much exclusively in the Hebrew speaking world. But today in Germany, in Czech, in other places, even in the United States among American Jews somewhat, Shoah started to catch on. So in recent years, even non-Hebrew speaking countries started to use the term. Now, a large influence had from that, of course, movies always have a large influence, but this is not just any movie. This is Claude Lanzmann's landmark, extremely long, I think it's a 9-hour long documentary, Shoah, in 1979. So that also had an impact on the non-Hebrew speaking world. Like I said before, the term Holocaust took much longer to catch on. It was used from a relatively early age in a very broad or vague way, but only was used in a more concrete way in describing specifically the Nazi extermination of European Jewry only by the mid-1950s, and much more even so decades later. In fact, there was a TV series in 1978 entitled The Holocaust, and that really popularized the terms. That's 1978. There's other cultural influences as well. So when focusing on these two most commonly accepted terms, Holocaust and Shoah, especially in recent decades, special emphasis is given to the word, the word and the capitalizing the word in English. Special emphasis is giving it a the in the prefix, the Holocaust, the Shoah, or in Hebrew, HaShoah, and also to capitalize it, H, capital, you don't have capital in Hebrew, but if you write Shoah in English, then it's a capital S. Now, why is that? Because there's a recognition that the term itself, the term Holocaust, is an ancient term. The term Shoah comes from Tanakh, it's an old term. So here we're talking about a specific Holocaust, a specific Shoah. The Holocaust, the Shoah, with the and with the capital H, capital S, to signify that although the term itself has antecedents in linguistic history, but now that it has come to describe the extermination of European Jewry by the Nazis during World War II, then it is the Holocaust, capital H, or the Shoah. Now, I happen to be okay with all of them. I don't have any personal vested interest here. I like all of the terms. I think all of them add to the discussion, add to the story. I think most of it is semantics. There is a lot of people, there is debate, a lot of debate, how you use it and what you mean when you use it. And it has ideological connotation, and it has religious overtones, and it has political overtones, and it has this and that and the other thing. I think the actual title is less important, as long as whatever it is acknowledged, believed, discussed, and transmitted and taught, then I'm fine. I'm fine with any term that's used, as long as we're still using it, as long as it's all acknowledged. There's a professor, a Holocaust historian, a very prominent one who I know personally, Professor Dani Michman, and one of the many things he's written is that he has a entire book of research, fascinating research, because he connects linguistic history to how it has an impact on historiography. I mean, well, it's definitely correlated. I don't know if it's what causal. It could be that the Holocaust narrative in historiography is, leads one to the choice of terminology. But he has a whole book on terminology of the Holocaust, and he explores there a whole chapter exploring Holocaust and Shoah in historiography, meaning which historian uses which term, why they use that term, what kind of narrative are they trying to convey because they use that term. Fascinating stuff. Another entire topic, which I don't want to currently get into, it's fascinating and relevant and lots to say on it. Can we use the above terms, Holocaust, Shoah, whatever it is, to describe other genocides? If I'm talking about the Armenian genocide, if I'm talking about the Rwanda genocide or the Cambodian genocide, or other exterminations, etc. Do I use the term genocide exclusively, or am I allowed to use the term Holocaust or Shoah? Is the Holocaust unique or not in world history? If yes, how so? If not, why not? We'll have to save that for another time. Another controversial topic relating to this is the Nazis killed many, many others besides for Jews during the Nazi regime, especially during the war itself. They killed millions of Soviet prisoners of war and Soviet citizens. They killed millions of Poles. They killed Czech citizens. They killed that's included in Soviet citizens, Belarusians. Like a quarter of the Belarusian population was exterminated. Massive extermination of murder of Belarusian citizens. Romani, Gypsy, what used to be referred to as Gypsies, now we call them Romani people. They were almost entirely exterminated. They were a small in number because there was only several thousand of them in Europe under Nazi occupation, but almost all of them were killed. They're the only other group besides for the Jews that almost the entire people were exterminated by the Nazis. The Nazis killed political enemies. They killed other asocial elements. So, when we refer to Nazi crimes and Nazi killing, they also killed some of their own people, mentally ill and terminal illness and all kind. They murdered their own people, Germans. So all those murders, that whole list I just said, do we say those are Nazi crimes, Nazi atrocities, Nazi murders, or do we say that fits under the umbrella of the great Nazi Holocaust? All of them are included in the Holocaust because the Nazis killed lots of people. So there's a famous saying from Elie Wiesel, not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims. There's a recognition that the Nazis were out to exterminate the entire Jewish people. They were not trying to exterminate the entire Polish people or Soviet people or Czech or Belarusian. Maybe Romani Gypsies is like that, maybe not. But so there's a big debate about whether you can use the term Holocaust to describe those murders or not. Now I want to focus for a few minutes, our remaining time together, on the so-called religious term, Churban, or Churban Europa. Now, first of all, the religious community who adopted this term, both in Israel and the United States, why were they opposed to using the terms Shoah or Holocaust? Why did they specifically want to use the term Churban or Churban Europa? Why was that preferable? And the reason is obvious, because it was connected to the Churban of the past, which I mentioned before, especially the Bais Hamikdash, the Churban Bais Hamikdash. If we coin a new term, brand new term, we need a brand new term, Shoah, Holocaust, then it means that we're putting it into its own category. We're disconnecting it from Jewish history, from Golus, from the rest of the exile, from the rest of our past. Where if we say Churban, destruction, then it's connecting to every single Churban we experienced all the way back to the destruction of the Bais Hamikdash. And that connects it better to the greater context of Jewish history and the story of the Jewish people in their exile. Perhaps this was the greatest of all Churban. This was the Churban Europa, Europe. Now, like I said, it's not exactly a religious term. I mentioned before Raoul Hilberg. I want to mention even the word Churban in Hebrew. There was a very famous poet, Uri Tzvi Greenberg, who would never be accused of being religious. He was definitely not religious. And he publicly campaigned against the word Shoah, and he said we have to use the word Churban. It's a much better term. It's part of Jewish history. It's not disconnected from Jewish history. It's not completely unique in Jewish history. And he led this unsuccessful campaign for 10, 20 years, used to speak about it publicly. And obviously, he wasn't the only one. He's probably the most famous one. So he was a secular poet. So it's just not just exactly only a religious term. But one of the big proponents in the United States about using the term Churban or Churban Europa as opposed to Shoah or Holocaust was Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, the famous Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivas Chaim Berlin, who I did a double episode on several years ago. You may want to check out those two episodes about him and his life. And he gave a very famous speech to a group of educators in 1977 in which he laid out his philosophy and his ideology that we should refer to those years and the extermination of European Jewry by the Nazis as the Churban Europa, not as the Holocaust or Shoah. He delivered the speech in Yiddish. The speech was translated into English by two students of his, including one of whom I'm very close with. I do trips with to Europe with his shul, Rabbi Yaakov Feitman, who I have a great admiration for. And I discussed this topic with him. And he was one of the translators of this article, and it was published in the Jewish Observer, which was then the magazine of Agudas Yisrael of America in 1977. Now, he goes through, it's an ideological position, a Torah position that he sets forth over there. Now, I've obviously the greatest respect for Rav Hutner, and that's I could prove that with my double episode on him, and I also have a personal affinity for Rabbi Feitman, who translated it, and I do trips with his shul. By the way, if your shul hasn't done a trip, you may want to do it because many shuls are doing it these days. But in that article, in that speech article, so there's the Torah element of the speech article, which is clearly the central theme, by the way, and one that I certainly accept, and obviously you don't need me to accept it. I would never dare dream of debating a great Torah scholar on a Torah topic, nor should anyone else. Obviously that's not something that I'm not going to even comment on that. The problem is that there's parts of the speech or article that has history, that he's laying out history, and he seems to be using the history element of the article or the speech to be a supporting argument to his Torah piece. Now, history is a matter of facts, not opinions, and has nothing to do with Torah knowledge. So I'm going to just make a couple of comments on exclusively on the history part, not the Torah part, obviously, and you make a disclaimer. There should be no misunderstanding in that regard. I'm not coming to any disrespect, God forbid, of Rav Hutner or his position, but he presents his historical points in a way that one of the reasons he doesn't like the term Shoah is because it was invented by Yad Vashem. So first of all, I don't know. Let's say it was. What's wrong with that? I mean, who cares that it was invented by Yad Vashem? Was there secular? I mean, okay. Well, the problem is it's not true. It wasn't invented by Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem was established in 1953. I mentioned before how the term Shoah was used in 1933, 20 years earlier. Maybe the newspaper journalists who were using the term Shoah in 1933 also were secular, so we have a problem with them also. I don't know. I'm not sure. Then he goes on to say that the Holocaust was not unique in Jewish history. Because we had the Churban Bais Hamikdash, so it's like the Churban. It's interesting because the people who actually experienced the Holocaust saw it differently. There's a famous quote from the Piasetzner Rebbe that in the Eish Kodesh of the Piasetzner Rebbe, Reb Klein Miskalma Shapiro, that he says he edits the Eish Kodesh at a later stage, right before he puts it in the Ringelblum archive. And in the edit, he goes back to a speech he gave in the Warsaw Ghetto. And in that speech, he said, "We've experienced many sufferings through Jewish history, and this is just another one of them. This seems to be harsher, but we have to remember that we've had things very similar in Jewish history." And when he edits it, and he's editing it 6 months later, in those 6 months was the great deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka. In other words, he gave the speech when it was just the horrifying, just in quotation marks, the horrifying conditions of the Warsaw Ghetto. But the final solution started after that. And the deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka, to the gas chambers, where the entire Warsaw Ghetto is almost the entire Warsaw Ghetto is exterminated in the gas chambers of Treblinka. So the Catastrophe Rebbe, who survives those deportations, he goes and edits his comment in the Eish Kodesh, and he says, "I wrote this before this past summer. This past summer was the great deportation of Warsaw Jewry to the gas chambers, and that makes it that what we're experiencing now has never happened in history, nothing like it, including the Bais Hamikdash." He specifically says that. So the Holocaust was something unique in Jewish history. And then the biggest historical issue with it is that one of the main points Rav Hutner is trying to make in the article has nothing really to do with the terminology of Holocaust, Shoah, or Churban Europa, but it's the fact that in his view is that the Holocaust was such a great tragedy because it was the first time, he calls it the East and West, the Arab world, the Muslim world, and the Christian world united to destroy the Jewish people. And that's based on a misunderstanding. I guess in 1977, many people misunderstood this. I know that even in recent years, the Prime Minister of Israel has misunderstood this. That there was a visit of the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, to Hitler in November and December 1941. And the claim that Rav Hutner is making and other people have made, the not historical claim, the not true claim, the false claim, I guess we'll say, is that the Mufti convinced Hitler to embark on the Holocaust, on the final solution, on the extermination of European Jewry. It was all the Mufti's fault. Anyone who studies a bit of Holocaust history knows it's not true. I mean, Hitler and first of all, by the time December 1941 came, the final solution had already been decided upon. It was already being implemented, right? The Chelmno gas chambers were basically operational already. The shootings had been happening in the East for several months already. The decision had taken place in October already in 1941. I'm not going to get into it. That's a whole other topic in its own merit. Lots to say on it. But the Mufti had zero impact on Hitler. Hitler used the Mufti and against the British mostly, but you know what? Maybe we'll do another episode on the Mufti and Hitler and to bust that myth. But that's not true. This whole story of the Mufti influencing Hitler in the final solution, there's lots to say on it. So we'll save that for another time. And anyways, I don't think it's so related to the terminology. So I'll just summarize, having said all this regarding the primary point that Rav Hutner is trying to make in referring to the Holocaust as Churban Europa and not the Shoah or Holocaust. So I'm totally fine with that. Anyone should be totally fine with that. Why not? I mean, it's a religious term. It's a good term. It sounds good. It evokes the memory of the destruction of the Bais Hamikdash. Like I said, I don't see any limitation in using one term or the other, as long as you're talking about it. That's the most important thing. This is Yehudi Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehudigeber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.